My name, chosen for this account, is Chloe. The concrete of the University of Washington's Greek Row felt cold even through the soles of my worn combat boots. It was late, past 1 a.m., and the air was thick with the faint metallic scent of the Puget Sound carried on a damp wind. My college housing was a cramped, slightly decrepit sorority annex house off 17th Avenue, a place steeped in generations of hurried, sleep-deprived student life. The building itself groaned constantly, its old lumber settling and shifting like a restless beast, a symphony of creaks that usually served as a peculiar comfort. The atmosphere inside was perpetually damp, a consequence of the Pacific Northwest weather and the building's ancient plumbing. Each floor smelled faintly of dust, old wood polish, and the ghosts of past residents' microwave popcorn. This wasn't a pristine dorm. It was a character-filled relic that held the weight of countless late nights and forgotten worries, and tonight, that weight felt heavier than ever. I was hunched over my desk, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a vintage banker's lamp. The essay on late-period romanticism was due in 7 hours, and my brain was running on fumes and lukewarm instant coffee. My concentration was shot, fragments of text swimming before my eyes. Every time I reread a sentence, the meaning seemed to dissolve, leaving behind only exhaustion. The silence of the house was unusual. Most nights, there was the distant thump of music or the muffled laughter from a late-night study group. Tonight, only the rhythmic click of my cheap mechanical keyboard broke the quiet. But even that felt too loud, intrusive in the sudden, heavy stillness that had settled over the house like a thick blanket. I rubbed my tired eyes, the red glow of the digital clock beside my laptop mocking my lack of progress. 2:38 a.m. My head throbbed with a dull ache, and the caffeine was doing nothing but making my hands shake. I knew I should keep working, but a profound, almost magnetic exhaustion was pulling me under, an urge so strong it felt like a physical force. My eyelids felt heavy, pulling downwards with a crushing, irresistible weight. I decided on a 15-minute power nap, a desperate gamble against the looming deadline. I pushed my chair back, the scuff of its wheels on the wooden floor sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. My twin bed, nestled against the wall, was covered in a chaos of textbooks and notes. I cleared a space, tossing the materials onto the floor with a quiet thud. The stack of books tumbled into a small, messy pile. I didn't bother changing, just collapsed onto the thin mattress, pulling the scratchy wool blanket up to my chin. The last coherent thought in my head was the opening line of my essay, a pointless piece of information that vanished as a sudden, intense cold swept over me. It was more than just a drop in temperature. It was an internal chill that seemed to radiate from my core outward, setting every nerve ending alight. My eyes snapped open. I hadn't closed them for more than a minute, but the room felt fundamentally changed. The comforting yellow light of my desk lamp was gone, replaced by an inky, suffocating darkness that seemed to press in on the walls, a darkness that was both visual and psychic. The familiar shapes of my desk, my dresser, my overflowing bookshelf were indistinct, monstrous silhouettes. I tried to sit up, to turn on the lamp, but my muscles refused to obey. My limbs were leaden, fused to the bed. A wave of icy panic washed over me, instantly recognizing the dreadful state. Sleep paralysis. My neurological wiring had betrayed me, leaving my consciousness a frantic prisoner in a useless, unresponsive body. I fought it, thrashing internally, commanding my body to move, but it was a useless effort against an invisible, unbreakable chain. My heart began to pound, a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs, so loud I thought it might burst through my chest wall. Then came the sound. A low, wet scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor just outside my closed bedroom door. The friction was agonizingly distinct, a sound that implied immense weight and unnatural movement. The sound was slow, deliberate, and undeniably growing closer, inching towards the door with a terrifying patience. My throat was clamped shut, bone dry, every attempt at a scream or even a whisper producing nothing but a strangled, pathetic gasp, a raw sound that died instantly in the thick air. My eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the door, its cheap, hollow core seeming to thin, to become almost translucent in the paralyzing fear, as if the darkness beyond was burning through the material. The scraping stopped, right outside the door. The silence that followed was immense, heavy, loaded with expectation. I could feel a presence there, beyond the wood panelling, a cold, dense concentration of dread that felt like a localized atmospheric anomaly. It wasn't the wind, not the old house settling. This was alive, focused, intelligent. A faint shadow, impossibly dark, began to seep underneath the door. It wasn't just a lack of light. It was a deeper, more viscous black that seemed to absorb any stray photon. It spread slowly across the floorboards, a creeping stain of absolute darkness, moving towards the foot of my bed with an oily fluidity. My breath hitched, caught in my throat, my lungs burning for air. The pressure on my chest intensified, a crushing weight that felt like an enormous, invisible hand pressing down, stealing my capacity to breathe. The creeping shadow reached the edge of my bed and began to rise, coalescing into a shape. Not a figure, not a person, but an upright column of pure, concentrated gloom, tall and unsettlingly still. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its scrutiny, a burning, invasive attention that stripped away any illusion of safety, making me feel utterly exposed, dissected. The cold intensified, a searing chill that made my teeth ache and my skin erupt in painful gooseflesh. A low, resonant hum started, emanating from the shadow. It vibrated through the mattress, through my body, resonating deep within my skull. It wasn't a sound heard, but a vibration felt, a frequency of primal dread that threatened to shatter my sanity. The hum carried with it a subliminal, guttural distortion, like 1,000 whispers played backward at once, a wave of incoherent, pure malevolence that hammered against my temporal lobe. The shadow figure seemed to lean over me, its form elongating, thinning, a tower of absolute blackness poised above my trapped body. My mind screamed in silent, desperate terror, but my body remained a rigid, useless shell. I was forced to watch, a helpless observer in my own nightmare. The pressure on my chest was agonizing now, my vision swimming with black spots from the lack of oxygen. The edges of my perception were fraying, the horror becoming too vast to contain. Then, my eyes, wide and strained, caught a flicker of movement near the foot of the bed, on the periphery of the looming shadow. A book, my copy of Frankenstein, a vintage edition with a heavy, cloth-bound spine. It had been tossed carelessly onto the floor when I cleared my space. As the shadow loomed, the book began to vibrate, almost imperceptibly at first, then violently. The pages fluttered, the spine arching, twisting in an impossible way that defied gravity and physics. And then, with a sharp, sickening crack, the book was lifted a few inches off the floor, rotating slowly, impossibly, in the air. This was no trick of the eye, no fleeting shadow play. This was a physical object, a solid piece of my reality, being manipulated by the unseen. This was the breaking point. The reality of the shadow was terrifying, but the impossible movement of the book, an object of my world, a symbol of logic and learning, shattered the last remnants of my rationalization. The sheer implication of what I was witnessing, the violation of natural law occurring inches from my face, was a horror that eclipsed the paralysis itself. My panic transformed not into madness, but into a desperate, animalistic will to survive. The terror became fuel. I channeled every ounce of my consciousness, every fragment of my trapped energy into a single, frantic purpose: move. I focused on the pain, on the rage, on the utter defiance of the force that dared to invade my space and mock my reality. My muscles twitched, violently, painfully. A finger, a toe, a millimeter of movement in my neck. The shadow pulsed, its humming vibration intensifying, trying to reassert its suffocating control. The book in the air spun faster, the pages a blur, before it was hurled against the wall, leaving a momentary dent in the dry plaster with a dull thud. The sound was a raw, aggressive punctuation mark on the fear. I ignored it all. I focused on my little finger, forcing it to curl. It was an agonizing, monumental effort, a silent scream of effort. A low moan escaped my lips, a ragged, guttural sound that tore through the oppressive silence. The shadow seemed to recoil slightly, its humming stuttering, momentarily destabilized by the sound, by the break in my silence. The pressure on my chest eased, just a hair. I seized the tiny advantage. I forced my arm to move, a heavy, dead weight against the sheets. It was slow, excruciating, like trying to lift a boulder submerged in mud. Inch by agonizing inch, I dragged my arm across the mattress, straining towards the edge of the bed where my desk lamp sat. The switch. That was the goal. My salvation. The shadow noticed the struggle. The humming intensified to a deafening, piercing whine that felt like needles scraping the inside of my brain. A concentrated sonic attack intended to force my surrender. The crushing pressure on my chest returned with twofold intensity, a vice grip. My breath was cut off entirely. My lungs seized. My consciousness felt like it was teetering on the edge of a great fall. But my hand, driven by a pure, primal desperation that bypassed fear entirely, was close. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the lamp base. I strained, contorted, forcing my wrist to twist, my fingers to claw for the rotary switch. The air was gone. My vision tunneled into a blinding white spot. Click. The instantaneous burst of light, that sickly, warm yellow glow of the desk lamp, was a physical blow to the darkness. The shadow figure recoiled instantly, silently, violently. It didn't so much dissipate as shatter, dissolving into 1,000 fragments of nothingness that were instantly banished by the light. The crushing pressure vanished. The piercing hum evaporated. The air, suddenly clean and cool, rushed back into my starving lungs in a series of deep, shuddering gasps that turned into hoarse, rattling sobs. The paralysis broke completely. I thrashed wildly, sitting bolt upright, tearing the blanket off me, my body slick with cold sweat. I gasped, sobbing, the sound tearing at my raw throat. I scrambled off the bed, stumbling backward until my back hit the wall, my wide eyes scanning the room, frantically searching for any trace, any lingering presence. The room was bathed in the steady, mundane light of the desk lamp. My books and notes lay scattered on the floor. My copy of Frankenstein sat not perfectly flat, but leaning slightly against the wall, a slight dent visible on the plaster near the book's edge, a tiny physical marker of the impossible event. The door was closed, secure. The only evidence of the horror was the violent, uncontrollable tremor that shook my body, the frantic, panicked drumming of my heart, and the raw ache in my muscles. I stood there for an eternity, pressed against the wall, hyperventilating, staring at the empty space where the shadow had stood. I finally staggered over to my desk, my legs wobbly, and collapsed back into the chair. I didn't turn off the light. I didn't even try to work. I just stared at the blank document on my laptop screen. 3:21 a.m., 4 minutes. 4 minutes had been an entire lifetime of terror. The memory of the event was chillingly vivid. The scraping, the creeping shadow, the agonizing paralysis, the impossible movement of the book. But the terror, that crushing, all-consuming dread, was already beginning to recede, replaced by a profound, exhausted clarity. It was over. The click of the lamp had banished it. It wasn't lingering, waiting in the periphery. It was simply gone. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the shadows soften and retreat under the growing natural light. When the sun finally rose, pouring a golden wash through my window, I felt utterly drained, but strangely, intensely peaceful. The panic had been spent, replaced by a weary resolve. I knew this was sleep paralysis, an aggressive, terrifying manifestation of a common parasomnia. But I also knew the sheer reality of the presence, the cold, the malice. I didn't need to reconcile the two. What I needed was control. I spent the next few days preparing. I bought a new lamp, a modern one with a quick-touch base, placing it on a sturdy stand directly beside my bed, eliminating the slow, rotary action. I installed smart lights with voice activation, making the illumination of the room an instantaneous command. I researched the subject, not just the clinical explanations, but the cultural and historical accounts, the folklore of the old hag, the Mara, the shadow figures. Every account, every theory I absorbed, not out of dread, but out of a fierce protective need to understand the mechanism of my own terror. I devoured medical journals describing the brain's mixed signals during rematonia, and sifted through centuries-old cultural tales of incubi and succubi, determined to find the common denominator that explained the feeling of intelligent malice. The paralysis returned 2 weeks later. I felt the familiar weight, the cold, the absolute stillness clamp down on me in the pre-dawn hours. But this time, there was no panic. My mind was instantly clear, sharp, focused. I felt the presence enter the room, a familiar shift in the air, a creeping dread that began to settle over my chest. It felt exactly the same, but my reaction was fundamentally different. I felt the shape begin to form at the foot of my bed, that familiar column of darkness coalescing from the gloom. The low hum started, a familiar internal vibration of malevolence. But this time, I didn't fight my body. I fought the fear. I acknowledged the presence, the hum, the weight, treating it not as a monster, but as a severe neurological event, accompanied by powerful, culturally reinforced hallucinations. I focused on my voice, that single, autonomous function my brain still held. It wasn't a scream I was aiming for. It was a word, a command, a single decisive act of defiance, a mental key to break the physiological lock. My throat was still dry, constricted. I tried once. A muffled, guttural sound escaped. The pressure tightened, the darkness looming closer, its hum intensifying in what felt like anticipation, a challenge. I tried again, pouring every ounce of my will, my resolve, my acceptance of the situation into the sound. I focused on the sheer mental force, the internal declaration that this experience, terrifying as it was, could not command me. No. It wasn't loud. It was a cracked, raspy sound, a single syllable forced out through sheer mental exertion, but it was clear. A word spoken into the void, a declaration of sovereignty, a command to the malfunctioning part of my own brain. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The shadow figure hesitated, its shape momentarily contorted, as if struck by an invisible, internal counterforce. The humming stopped dead. The oppressive cold vanished, replaced by a sudden neutral warmth. The pressure on my chest lifted entirely, the paralysis shattered. I sat up, breathing deeply, evenly. The room was dark, silent, untouched. I reached out and touched the lamp base, warm, solid. I took another deep breath, the lingering traces of fear dissolving with the simple act of conscious control. It didn't return that night. It didn't return the next week. It didn't return the next month. The episodes became infrequent, fading over the rest of my college years to rare, muted events that I could banish with a simple, calm effort of will. The power of the shadow was the power I lent it through panic. Once I understood that, the terrifying reality of the presence became irrelevant. I had faced the terror, understood its mechanism, and taken back the one thing it had tried to steal: my agency. The fear was gone. The mystery remained, but the terror was spent. The unknown was still out there, but I had learned to close the door when it tried to enter. The darkness no longer held power over me. I had found my peace in the light.